What if I told you that the most powerful weapon in war was not the sword, nor the arrow, but the written word? In the year 1427, 200,000 soldiers of the Ming dynasty marched into Dai Viet, certain of victory. Yet their downfall would come, not from steel, but from the pen of a single man, a scholar and poet named Nguyen Trai. For more than a decade, the people of Dai Viet had endured the heavy hand of Ming occupation. Villages were burned, fields lay barren, and the Lam Sun rebels under Loi fought on with little food and dwindling strength. By this point, many believed the end was near. To crush the resistance once and for all, the Ming court dispatched a massive relief force, 200,000 men, heavily armed and provisioned, marching south to reinforce their garrisons. The contrast was overwhelming. On one side, the might of an empire, on the other, a worn and hungry band of insurgents. In any ordinary war, the result would have been certain. But Nguyen Trai was no ordinary strategist. Trained as a scholar, gifted as a poet, and trusted as the chief advisor to Loi, he understood that victory could be won in the hearts and minds of the enemy. Instead of relying only on blades and bloodshed, he prepared to wield a far more subtle weapon: words. Nguyen Trai understood that an army could be destroyed without ever meeting it in open battle. Steel could kill soldiers, but it could not touch the will that drove them forward. To defeat the Ming, he believed, one had to break that will to weaken the enemy from within before the clash of arms ever came. So he turned to the one weapon he trusted most, the written word. By the light of an oil lamp, he took up his brush and began to compose letters, not for allies or generals, but for the enemy themselves. Each letter was carefully crafted, appealing to reason and compassion, but also to the soldiers' deepest fears. He reminded them that they were far from home, dying in a foreign land for a cause that was not their own. He urged them to think of their families, of the possibility of never returning, of the futility of spilling blood on soil that would never honor their names. And then he offered a way out. Surrender, he promised, and you will be shown mercy. Lay down your weapons, and you may live to see your homeland again. Refuse, and you will perish in a land that is not yours. These letters found their way into Ming camps through scouts, messengers, or even captured soldiers released to spread the words. At night, by the dim glow of lanterns, men read them in secret. Some scoffed, dismissing them as lies. But others lingered over the words, their eyes heavy with doubt. Whispers began to ripple through the tents, carried from soldier to soldier. Every letter was like an arrow aimed at the heart. And though no blood had been spilled, the cracks in the Ming army's resolve had already begun to spread. If the first letters sowed doubt, Nguyen Trai's next move was to turn doubt into fear. He knew that once suspicion took hold in an army, it could spread faster than fire, consuming unity and trust. So he began to craft not only messages of mercy, but carefully designed forgeries meant to confuse and divide. Some letters claimed that Ming generals had already been killed. Others insisted that reinforcements would never arrive, that supply lines had been cut, or that the emperor in Beijing had abandoned the campaign altogether. Still more suggested that surrender was not only acceptable, but imminent, that high-ranking officers were already negotiating in secret. The genius of Nguyen Trai's method lay in mixing truth with falsehood. Real defeats were exaggerated, rumors of setbacks were magnified, and false reports were delivered with enough detail to feel authentic. Even the most disciplined soldier could not dismiss them entirely. And the whispers began. Around campfires, men argued in hushed voices about whether their commanders were lying. One soldier swore he had seen a letter proving their general was dead. Another denied it, but could not be certain. At first, the officers laughed off the rumors, declaring them tricks of the enemy. But even they could not escape the creeping suspicion. Glances turned sharp, trust eroded, and cooperation at the highest levels began to falter. The Ming army still appeared whole on the outside. Their camps were filled with banners, their formations precise, their weapons sharp. But inside, where it mattered most, the spirit that bound them together was unraveling. Every day that passed without battle was a day when their confidence drained away. Every night, as soldiers tried to sleep, the voices of doubt returned, echoing louder than the beat of any drum. The rebels of Lam Sun did not need to fight to see the results. They watched as the enemy hesitated, delayed, and second-guessed. Orders were carried out more slowly, patrols were more cautious, and discipline grew weaker. It was as though the mighty force of 200,000 men had become a hollow shell, armed but already broken within. Nguyen Trai had turned psychology into a weapon. The enemy's strength was no longer in its numbers, but in the fragile illusion that those numbers still mattered. And day by day, that illusion was slipping away. By the late months of 1427, the effect of Nguyen Trai's letters was undeniable. The Ming army was still vast in number, but doubt and fear had hollowed it from within. Sensing the moment had come, the Lam Sun rebels began to combine the power of words with the force of arms. They did not march out for open battle against an enemy so much larger. Instead, they chose to strike in ways that would confirm every rumor already circulating in the enemy's camp. Small detachments vanished into forests and never returned. Supply convoys were cut down in sudden ambushes, their wagons left smoldering on lonely roads. Outposts were assaulted under the cover of darkness, and watchtowers were found burned to the ground by dawn. Each of these actions in isolation might have seemed like nothing more than raids. But to soldiers already living under the shadow of Nguyen Trai's words, they felt like undeniable proof that the enemy was everywhere, and that defeat was only a matter of time. Every ambush magnified the rumors, every fire confirmed the whispers, and every disappearance reinforced the belief that survival could not be won through resistance. This was the genius of the strategy. The letters had weakened the enemy's spirit, but it was the sword that gave those words substance. Together they formed a trap more powerful than any wall or fortress, a psychological snare that turned numbers into a burden rather than a strength. Imagine yourself as one of those soldiers. You are far from home, the supply lines faltering, whispers in your camp growing louder each night. Then, as fear presses on your chest, you hear that yet another detachment has failed to return. Would you still believe in victory? Or would you begin to wonder if the war had already been lost? By the time the Ming realized what was happening, it was too late. The pen had already pierced their spirit, and the sword merely made the wound visible. By the autumn of 1427, the trap that Nguyen Trai had prepared was ready to close. The Ming forces still looked formidable on the surface, with their banners raised and their formations intact, yet inside they were already weakened by fear and suspicion. All that was needed was a decisive blow, and it came at Kai Lang. There, the commander Liang Sheng led his vanguard forward, with the intention of breaking through to his allies. But the Lam Sun rebels knew the terrain far better than their enemy, and they lay hidden in the mountain passes. When the moment came, they struck with precision. The Ming troops, caught off guard and pressed into narrow ground, fell into chaos. Liang Sheng himself was killed in the fighting, and news of his death raced through the camps faster than any messenger could carry it. For an army already drowning in doubt, this was the final confirmation of every rumor they had heard. If their leaders had truly fallen, if reinforcements were not coming, then what hope remained? Confidence collapsed overnight, and the soldiers who had once marched with such certainty now found themselves unable to trust either their commanders or one another. When the second great force under Mu Thang reached Zhuangjiang, they discovered not a relieved ally but an encircled garrison, exhausted and desperate. The Lam Sun rebels had already cut off every route of escape, surrounding the Ming on all sides. Hunger gnawed at the soldiers, fear drained their strength, and within the walls despair grew heavier with each passing hour. Then came the final letter from Nguyen Trai. It offered life to those who surrendered and promised death to any who resisted. The choice was stark, and resistance seemed pointless. One by one, weapons were laid down. And soon, tens of thousands of Ming soldiers knelt in the dust of a foreign land, no longer an invading army, but captives of their own broken will. The pen had struck the decisive blow, and the sword had only confirmed what words had already achieved. The surrender at Zhuangjiang was more than the conclusion of a single campaign. It marked the collapse of the Ming's ambitions in Dai Viet. What had begun as a massive expedition of 200,000 men ended in humiliation, with tens of thousands taken prisoner and their commanders forced to yield. For the Ming dynasty, it was a bitter reminder that overwhelming numbers could not guarantee victory. For Dai Viet, the moment was nothing less than liberation. After more than a decade of devastation, the people saw the invader finally driven out. Villages that had been burned could now be rebuilt. Fields left barren could once again be sown. And a nation that had seemed destined for subjugation had proved its resilience against one of the most powerful empires of its age. At the heart of this triumph stood Nguyen Trai. Not only had he shaped strategy in the shadows, he also gave the victory its voice. In the aftermath, he composed the Bin and Go Proclamation, a document often regarded as one of the earliest declarations of independence in Asia. It did not simply celebrate a military triumph. It proclaimed that Dai Viet was a nation with its own culture, its own history, and the right to stand equal among others. Through both ink and steel, Nguyen Trai had turned the tide of history. And in doing so, he proved that even empires can be undone not only by force of arms, but by the power of words. Nguyen Trai's victory was not only a triumph of strategy, but a lesson that has echoed through centuries. He showed that the mightiest armies can be undone, not just by weapons, but by the power of the human mind. Where swords bring death, words can shape destiny. The pen that guided the fall of the Ming became the foundation of a nation's independence. Today, historians remember him not simply as a poet or advisor, but as the voice of Dai Viet's freedom, a man who proved that intellect and courage together could alter the course of history. So the question remains, in our own time, which is truly stronger, the sword or the word? If you want to see how another brilliant strategy destroyed the Mongol fleet at the Battle of Bac Dang in 1288, click here. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold history documentaries.